Donald Trump has a plan on tariffs. Is it working? It might if he stops getting in his own way. Also, the Carney coalition, is it viable? And will the conservatives be able to pick up any seats even if it falls apart? Ian Lee from the Sprott Business School from Carleton University will be here in a moment talking the so-called trade deal between the US and China. And Jamie Carroll, our liberal anti-panelist from the election, on how Carney is doing so far, but what might be about to come. All that and more on the latest episode of On the Line. This episode of On the Line is brought to you by Innovative Medicines Canada. With a new government in place, one thing remains clear. Canada must continue to prioritize patients and healthcare innovation. Innovative Medicines Canada is focused on collaborating with all levels of government to improve access to life-saving medicines and develop a healthcare system that prioritizes patients, ignites innovation, and drives economic growth. Canada's innovative medicines sector plays a critical role, not just in health outcomes, but in keeping us competitive on the global stage. That's why, even during a moment of political change, Innovative Medicines Canada is staying focused on the issues that matter most to Canadians. And as Canada moves forward with national pharmacare, Innovative Medicines Canada believes it's possible to expand access without limiting choice by strengthening what works and fixing what doesn't. Visit innovativemedicines.ca to learn more. Well, Ian, here we are on a beautiful Monday afternoon. And, look, it is always a pleasure to talk with you, but I'll be honest, I planned on this episode being almost all political. I didn't plan on having economics in it. But on Sunday, the United States and China had a meeting in Switzerland, and they came out and they announced not a final deal, but a truce, a 90-day pause where they're both going to lower tariffs on each other. They're still going to be a lot higher than they were 3 months ago, but they're bringing them down. And they're going to try and hammer out a deal here. So you and I have something in common, that we're both free traders. I like free trade, rising tide, lifting all boats, blah, blah, blah. Insert your cliche. I like free trade. My life has benefited from free trade. I am richer and more comfortable than I would have been otherwise because of access to goods from all over the world.
Absolutely.
I also think there's an argument for tariffs in a limited scope, particularly if you wanted to go, hey, we don't want to have all of our national security or strategic interests being provided to us by a potentially hostile country. I get it. I understand that security will eventually trump pure Adam Smith economics. I'm a realist about that. So I had an open mind to what the Trump tariff policy might be. I thought, hey, if they tariff China in a really selective way to bring critical national security infrastructure back to the United States or other friendly countries, I could live with that. It's not what we got.
That's right.
We got something really weird and confusing. So let's talk in the big picture first before we talk China.
Yes.
What do you think has been the effect so far of the last 3 months of, I guess, kind of chaotic trade policy coming out of the United States?
Right. First and foremost, I agree with you completely. Not to be nice, I've supported every free trade agreement initiated or that Canada participated in since 1988 when Mulroney proposed FTA. I mentioned that. That's not a sidebar. I mean, on a continuum, free trade agreements are the absolute antithesis of tariffs. Tariffs are at one end of the spectrum, free trade's at the other, because to put it as crudely and bluntly as possible, free trade is mostly about the elimination of tariffs and non-tariff barriers. It's the end of, or the elimination of protectionism. Okay. I've also said, and I said this in the op-ed in the National Post, where I was doing a summary exegesis of Stephen Marin, the chief economist of the White House, to Trump paper. So it sounded quite sympathetic. People wrote me and said, why are you defending Trump? Well, I'm not defending Trump. I was trying to explain that, yes, he did have a plan. It was very radical and very audacious to completely reform the Bretton Woods international trading system that the Americans had established at the very tail end of in 1945 when they set up the World Bank, the IMF, the UN. I mean, they set up the whole shebang. And so then Trump came along and proposed this. And I guess I got a bit of cognitive dissonance. I am opposed to all tariffs of all kinds by any country, anywhere in the world, except for national security grounds. And what I was noticing in all this huge, progressives and liberals and conservatives tearing out their hair, especially in Canada over tariffs, was I said, hold it, everybody. Trump is using tariffs to beat up on all the other countries of the world who are doing what? Imposing tariffs. So we should be sort of, in a weird way, happy that he is declaring war on tariffs using tariffs. So then we should hope that he wins. That is to say, we want a tariff-free world or something awfully close. And that's the first point. The second point I want to make is that I was not one of those people that said that this is going to fail. First off, I divide the world up into what I now call, that's just a cute little phrase I've come up with, I think it's cute, the single-digit GDP countries of the world, which, by the way, is every country of the world except China, US, and EU. I'm treating the EU as one nation. I know it's not, but for the purpose of this, let's talk about it like that. All the other countries, Japan, 5 trillion. That's a big economy. It's still single digit. And so I predicted that the single digit countries would cave, to put it
include us. We're about 2 trillion. So that's Canada.
That's Canada. But we would cave because we have no choice. They're the hegemon, $30 trillion, the US, and we're 2.3 trillion. And guess what? This is arithmetic. We're not going to win, and no other country in the world that's a single digit is going to win. So I predicted, and that's exactly what happened. They beat their door down to the White House, and apparently there's traffic jams around the White House, metaphorically speaking, of all the countries saying, we want to do a deal with you to reduce those tariffs if you'll reduce them on us. Then it came to the China and EU, and I've been predicting very, very steadily, consistently, that they were going to come to a deal because it was not out of intimidation, but because it was in the strategic self-interest of China and the European Union to do so. China's 19 trillion, EU's 17 trillion, US is 30 trillion. And China and the US are so codependent. I mean, if I was a psychologist, I would be probably drawing on all the literature on codependency, because if there's 2 countries in the world that are codependent, it's China and the U.S. That's why they're never going to blow each other up. This is way beyond mutual assured destruction. They're not going to. I like to say to my students, the funny thing about really rich people, billionaire rich kind of people, they don't want to become poor. Rich people like being rich. And the billionaires aren't going to risk going into a nuclear war, blowing up the United States and losing all their money. And the Chinese, so I'm trying to be a little bit humorous, but China desperately needs the U.S. and because they need those markets in the U.S. as the largest economy to sell all that stuff that the Americans can no longer make competitively. And the Americans need it because they can't make all that stuff competitively. The stuff that's at Walmart and at Costco and at Home Depot and at Lowe's, all the mass market consumer stuff. And it's trillions, literally. And so it was inevitable that they were going to come to a deal. And I think that that's what we're now seeing.
One of the concerns I have, and look, I'm with you. I've joked about this. If it takes Donald Trump to allow me to buy French butter, like, I have an open mind to it. Now, I'm mostly joking when I say that before anyone gets mad at me, but I understand that using the power of the American, what you called it correctly, economic hegemony could be useful. It could actually force a lowering of barriers. I don't know what's going to happen with the US and China, because here's the concern I have, and this is drifting from the realm of economics into politics. Incoherence from the White House, where you or I could design a tariff plan that imposed economic and political costs on countries until they came to the table and cut some kind of mutually beneficial deal. Yes. I'm just not convinced that's what these guys are doing. And I'm looking at, just for example, we were talking earlier before we started recording, the desire of the U.S. pretty overtly is to reshore manufacturing industries in the United States. If I am sitting on a $12 billion investment in some new manufacturing plant and I'm looking at putting it in Alabama or Michigan or something, I'm going to wait to see what the White House settles on before I commit $12 billion. Because if they keep changing their mind every 4 to 6 weeks, I'm not spending that money.
Matt, you're right. A couple of responses, 2 points to respond to that. First off, the uncertain business, I've argued for my entire life in the business school, because I was 9 years in banking before that. There's this sort of stereotype amongst professors and universities who've never worked in business that companies are all just a bunch of greedy little profit maximizing people running around like that. Businesses hate uncertainty. They hate that way more than losing money. They really do. It just scares the hell out of them, to be blunt. And what Trump is doing now is exercising maximum uncertainty, which causes rich people to sit on their wallets, on their money. You're absolutely right. Having said that, and again, I want to be very careful that I'm not seen or interpreted to be supporting Trump, because I am opposed completely to tariffs. But I'm just looking at this, if I can be so pompous, I guess, and pretend that I'm Henry Kissinger, and I'm looking at this geopolitically like he did it, because I admired him so much as a deep strategic thinker. You know, the U.S. is the largest economy in the world. And the reason it is the superpower, the reason it is the reserve currency of the world is because it's the least dirty shirt. And so people say, my students even say, how is it possible they're so rich? Look at all the crazy people there and guns and lack of health care and inequality and they go on and on through the long, long list. And I say, listen, least dirty shirt. You think they got problems?
Great place to invest.
Yeah, look at Russia. You got your alternatives. You're not investing in some theoretical world that doesn't exist. Your choice is to invest in Russia. Are you dreaming? How about the Middle East? Are you kidding? How about Venezuela? Nope, nope. China, they regulate everything and they expropriate your capital if they don't like it. So the U.S., what I'm trying to say is this. In the short run, there's very serious uncertainty going on in the United States. But I think it's going to be net at the end of the day. And the end of the day, in my instance, in my context, means a year from now, when all the trade agreements have been signed, or most of them have been signed and settled, we're going to see a measurable movement of capital into the United States. Some of it out of fear because they don't want to be caught on the outside of potential tariffs. Some of it out of strategic self-interest, because if you want to sell high-tech AI, I don't know, spy planes to the Pentagon, you damn well better be located in the United States. Okay, so some of it will be locational advantage. Some of it will be driven by fear. But I do believe, and I'm not suggesting they're going to have people write me and say they can't start making shirts again. Of course, they're not going to be making shirts again, because they're the textile business is this so low wage business, and they're not. But they can make F-150 trucks. They can make Boeing airplanes at $250 million a copy. That's also manufacturing. They can make very, very large chip plants for very, very large computing. So what I'm saying is the reshoring that I think that they're doing is a reshoring of higher end value added manufacturing. And the second point I want to make, to your point, that Trump is so erratic. He is. I completely agree. And he's his own worst enemy. He contradicts himself. He overrules himself, and so forth. I note with great interest that the smartest guy in that administration, which is Mr. Bessent, who worked for many years for another really smart guy called George Soros. In fact, it was Bessent in the articles I've been reading in the New York Times and the Atlantic Monthly, who was the brains behind George Soros, who urged, very young Mr. Bessent, urged George Soros back in the late 90s to short the UK pound that made Mr. Soros into a multi-billionaire. Well, Bessent was in Switzerland this weekend, not Trump, doing the discussions with the Chinese foreign minister, I believe. So the fact that they put their biggest brain, who is the smartest brain in that government, on the ground to do the broad big picture framework, tells me that Trump has realized, hey, I better step back and let some people do this that really know what they're doing. And he sent Bessent over there, and I took that as a very positive sign that it won't be run by the erratic Donald Trump.
So let me ask you a question here, and I would never be so unkind as to ask anyone to make a prediction about what Donald Trump is going to do. It's, as we've said, it's erratic. What would an optimal trade deal look like between the U.S. and China? Because Mr. Trump does have a domestic political base that he has gotten all whipped up. He has sold tariffs as a net positive. They are a good thing, bringing jobs back to these communities, particularly in where parts of the United States that have deindustrialized with all the social and economic ills that brought. I'm trying to figure out what his final win condition is going to be, because I do think Mr. Trump, as erratic and incoherent as he can be, he wants a win. He wants a win that he will claim credit for and that will be visible. How do you think he's going to try and do that? And I don't know if it's going to work, but from Mr. Trump's perspective or from Mr. Bessent's perspective, what will they be aiming for with China? Maybe China won't cooperate, but what will the United States try to get?
I looked at the trade, big picture aggregates, what sectors the economy, that sort of thing. Is China exporting to the US and what is China importing from the US? And I do think they can do a trade deal. It will not be a quote free trade deal where everything flows in like a la NAFTA. There's going to be areas of the economy that I think will be tariff free, and there's other parts of the economy in the same agreement that will tolerate high tariffs on both sides. So in terms of the what does China need, I found out in my research before I came to talk to you, because I always look up more data and stuff because I'm fascinated by that. China is the largest single importer on planet Earth of liquefied natural gas. Now, that should be no surprise because they're the largest user of coal in the world. 60% of their energy is from coal, and the Chinese government has repeatedly said publicly, we want off coal, but we're not going to get off coal until we have reasonable alternatives, which means in the interest of China. And that's why they're bringing in LNG. And of course, the US wants to sell LNG and oil. They also buy a lot of American oil. They need American agriculture. These are same products for Canada, but we're not talking about Canada. So I think that they will certainly, and Trump has said publicly on the record, I want China to buy more of our stuff. I think they will come to an understanding that the stuff that China wants is mostly natural resources, writ large, and that includes soy, and it includes corn, and it includes meat, and it includes beef, and it includes liquefied natural gas, and so forth. I think that they will. He's been very clear. He's never going to walk away from the Rust Belt of manufacturing cars. He has them on. My God, he had them on the White House lawn.
Yeah.
From the UAW, for God's sake. So I think that the Chinese know that they're not going to be exporting EVs to the United States, notwithstanding those cars are vastly cheaper than anything the Americans can make. You can buy a Seagull for 15,000 US outside of the US. It's a very good small EV from China, from BYD, the Chinese manufacturer. Yep. And so I think that they know that they're not going to be sending that kind of manufacturers. Let's call it sophisticated manufactured goods. I think that he's going to allow, let's call it, I don't mean to be judgmental, but unsophisticated consumer goods. All the stuff you see, plastic shovels in Walmart. All the stuff you see basically in Walmart or Target or Costco or Lowe's, and I don't mean the timber and the wood that's too heavy, but all the light stuff that's mass manufactured. I think that stuff is going to come in maybe with small tariffs, but they're not going to try and stand in the way of that. So I think that it's going to be a trade agreement that's going to appeal to the self-interest of both sides, and the U.S. will keep out manufactured goods. Specifically, that means automobiles, and of course, they're not going to allow China to buy anything sophisticated information technologies, artificial intelligence technologies. So they're going to be off limits, but they're going to carve out, let's call them spheres of influence of where I'm willing to trade with you and you're willing to trade with me. So it's going to be mutual self-interest. It's not going to be a, quote, free trade agreement. It's going to be a managed trade agreement that spells out what areas are okay and what areas are not okay to be traded with the U.S. and vice versa with China.
So you'll have your low-value trinkets on the shelves in Target, but we won't be buying cars and chips and weapons and munitions and...
That's right. Yes, I do think that this is happening. And I think at the end of the day, I said in the op-ed in the National Post about Marin, I said, I really believe that what the Americans are trying to do, even though he's erratic and he's crazy, he does have a single overarching idea, which we know what it is. It's called MEGA, Make America Great Again, and people can laugh at it. But what he wants, the way language I use because I'm a professor, is the hegemon wants to become even bigger and more hegemonic. This is the Roman Empire at the time of the peak of you love history and I do too. This is Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar times 1,000 on steroids. I mean, he wants to make the Roman Empire, because it's now called the American Empire, he wants to make it bigger. And I think he's going to. They're already at 30 trillion, and they didn't get there by an accident of history. And so I think that they want to make it bigger, and he's going for the manufacturing because that's his base. These are the people of Ohio that voted for him, and rural Pennsylvania and so forth. The Rust Belt states all voted overwhelmingly for him. And so he's going to make America, he's going to reshore some of the stuff, not all. T-shirts and textiles and low-value stuff is never going to come back to the States. But and we're going to have to really pay attention to this, because I'm starting to think that our auto industry, he sees it as low-hanging fruit, and we're going to have to think, what happens if we lose the auto industry with our 1.3 million produced cars? And I think we're going to have to start looking at pivoting to resources writ large, not just oil and gas, anything that's resources, timber, potash, nuclear fuel, canola, and because Asia needs it big time, as does Germany. They even said, we don't want your cars, we want your resources. So we may learn from the agreement that they strike with China what we ought to be doing with the U.S.
Ian, I got to let you go after this, but you mentioned a minute ago spheres of influence. I get the feeling we're about to be invited to fall in line with the sphere of influence the Americans will decree that we belong to, theirs.
Exactly. I
And we
Precisely.
I don't know if we'll be annexed. I don't know if we'll be the 51st state. I think not. But I do think we will get new economic marching orders and we will be invited to participate.
I agree. That's exactly my view. And they don't even need to annex us. They don't even need to eradicate the 49th parallel. They'll just be, we'll, like the Warsaw Pact,
Yeah.
we'll
A
be
client state.
a client state. But be very comfortable client state.
Well, you said a minute ago that I know my history. I do. That's why I lost all my hair. All of this seems very familiar. I, I know where some of this goes. It doesn't always
Exactly.
go great.
That's right.
Um, Ian Lee, Sprott Business School, Carleton University. Thank you. Great to talk again. Your op-ed in the National Post. Everybody should check it out. And we will talk with you soon. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks very much, Matt. My pleasure.
Coming up in moments, Jamie Carroll of Carroll and Company Consulting will be here with me. He was our sacrificial liberal for our anti-panel during the recent election. He's a great guy. He's got a lot to say. We're going to talk about Mark Carney, Pierre Poilievre, a little bit of cabinet speculation, where things went right and wrong for the liberals, where things went right and wrong for the conservatives, and where things went wrong for the NDP. Stay tuned. This is On the Line. Jamie, great to have you back. You were one of our intrepid, hardworking anti-panelists during the election. It's a couple of weeks after the election now, and there's a lot to talk about. But one of the things I want to open with here, as a show mostly sincere of humility, you were right and I was wrong. And what I tried to explain to someone once about my job is that basically I am making statements in public 4, 5, 6 days a week. If I have a 95% accuracy, I'm still wrong at least once a month.
Sure, but you'd still be a Hall of Famer.
Yeah, but I still need to eat it when I'm wrong because
Fair enough.
that's the credibility. Like if I don't eat it, I'm wrong. So you're here because I was wrong and you were right.
Could you send my ex-wife a letter that says that, by the way?
That's an extra fee, but yeah,
Okay,
I mean,
fine.
just like,
I'll
well,
tack that
my
on.
people will talk to your people.
Fair enough.
Um, so months and months and months ago, Justin Trudeau was still prime minister. Mark Carney was still, will he, won't he? He hadn't come in yet. Pierre Poilievre had a 20, 25 point lead.
Yep.
You told me this could change fast. And I thought to myself, yeah, events happen. It can change fast. But Poilievre could lose half his lead and he's still going to win a majority government.
Yep.
So I was thinking just in terms of just the magnitude of the kind of change that would be required. As of right now, when we're recording this, because we are recording this a little bit early, that's why we're not going to get into cabinet speculation, as much fun as that would be. 170 liberal seats. And I think that's just, Jamie, fascinating.
Yep.
Because if you went back in time 6 months and you told the liberals you'd have 170 seats, they'd be hitting their knees in prayer of
Oh,
thanks.
the level of ecstatic jubilation that you would get at, let's take the caucus Christmas party in December, the day or maybe 2 days after Chrystia dropped her nuclear tweet, right?
Yep.
That was, at least socially among liberals here in Ottawa, the low water mark for holy crap, it's all going to come to an end. What does my CV look like? Staffers were looking for open windows. Like that was bad, right? So if you take that, which is only 5 months, as your low water mark and look at today, any liberal who is complaining, oh my God, I can't believe we didn't get the majority. What happened to this seat and that seat? And can go pound salt. Right? Because it should have been inconceivable to be where we're at today. Now, having said that, I did say that Pierre would lose, and here's why. Stephen Harper wasn't particularly likable, but he exuded competence, right? And people looked at him and went, well, I don't really want to have a beer with him, but he's probably got his checkbook balanced. And I suspect that, all of the mature grown up stuff around his house is done. Um, and that was good enough. People were like, yeah, okay, liberals, sponsorship, all sorts of questionable activities. Let's let them sit over here for a while. Then we got Ignatieff, and it was really a long way away. And so, that was fine. That made sense. People could look at Harper and go, okay. The problem with Polyev was always the same, that he just exudes a sort of unjustified smarminess that suggests he's probably not great to have a beer with, that he probably isn't quite forthright on his taxes if he wasn't a government employee, that he just you get that feeling, right? And I think what we saw through the election, in the polling in particular, was that was especially true of women, right? At every age, he had a disadvantage with women once the polling tipped. All I really saw ahead of time, and I think, I don't pretend for a minute I'm the only one who saw this, was that he wasn't that likable, right? And that the only thing he had going for him was that Justin Trudeau had become even less likable. And so as soon as there was some viable alternative other than Justin, um, Poilievre's numbers were going to show just how soft they were. Now, did I think at the time it was going to happen that quickly or that thoroughly? Maybe not, but it never felt as safe as the folks who were measuring the drapes around Langevin seemed to think it was.
The funny thing about Polyev and the conservatives and the people who are conservatives, and particularly Polyev conservatives, is that I don't know how much of what you just said they would disagree with. And one of the things that's been fascinating about Polyev is that the people who love him, and he had a really high vote share, like 8
Yeah,
million Canadians voted for him,
yeah,
would probably tell you the reason they voted for him is probably mostly the same reasons 8.5 million Canadians didn't vote for him. There's this weird thing going on with him where I remember at the time, and it became such a stupid social media moment, but where he munched that friggin' apple
yeah,
while talking to that small town media guy.
yeah,
There are people I know, real human beings, who thought that was the worst thing they'd ever seen in their life.
yep,
There are other people who thought it was the best political moment they had ever seen.
yep,
And I have had the misfortune of finding myself in some rooms where those people are there at the same time. And I'm just here to make friends. And I've got to listen to these two people talk to each other. Polyev embraced deliberately a very aggressive, confrontational style. And by doing that, he drove up conservative numbers to higher than they have been since Brian Mulroney. He
yep.
also alienated a huge share of the country, including, as you say, women here. And the thing that I find incredible, we were saying a minute ago, Jamie, that 6 months ago, the Christmas party, you're absolutely right. Perfect example. Night of the Christmas party, liberals would have been ecstatic to find out they would be at 170 by the time the recounts were done.
Mhm.
Conservatives would have been shocked and furious to find out that they'd be at 144, I think it is right now.
Free.
143 now. As of 2 weeks before the election, if
Mhm.
you told the conservatives 143, they would have been ecstatic.
Yeah,
It was one of the weirdest elections I've ever seen where the liberals went from we're going to lose this thing in a historic way to being somewhat disappointed they didn't stick the landing for a majority in
yep,
about 8 weeks. And
yep.
the conservatives went from expecting complete victory to being in absolute panic to, wow, we held them to a minority in about 3 weeks.
Yeah, so look, picking up on sort of the sentiment of the anti-panel from the campaign, I there's praise to be had for both Polyev and the conservative campaign in general. And I think, the folks chasing after Jenny Byrne with pitchforks probably should cool it a bit. I mean, I think, there were certainly elements of arrogance and hubris there that weren't really merited or necessary. But And the failure to pivot is a whole discussion on its own. But look, I think they got 45% in Ontario compared to Doug Ford's 43. Huge deal. Flipped a bunch of 905 ridings that, my guys were absolutely banking on in that last couple of weeks. I think they knew that they were in trouble, but that was where their majority was. I think, held everything in the prairie wall that they had to, and overall reduced the race to a two-party contest, right? I mean, the Bloc and the NDP were almost irrelevant, right? But the biggest win is that they did such a good job campaigning against Trudeau and the carbon tax for 2 years that my party got rid of both for them before they gave the electorate a chance. And that, to me, is a big part of the lesson, is that we're not in the US. You can't be in a permanent campaign because there aren't fixed campaign dates, right? You can easily have the other party, whether it's my guys or the Tories or whoever, come along and go, you're right, we're dumping this guy because he's dead weight and we're going to take off in another direction. Interesting note I would watch for by, sort of first part of June when the Liberal caucus is meeting and, the House is resumed. Does the Liberal Party now, after this experience with not being able to get rid of Trudeau, adopt the Michael Chong bill and give caucus the power to oust a leader? Don't know. I would say they should, up until the party restores the provision in the Constitution that allows for a leadership review at every biennial. But that's my free advice.
So, okay, there's so much to talk about, but I want to respond to that, and
Yeah.
I'm going to embrace something that my friend and colleague Chris Selly has said many times. The Reform Act does not give parliamentarians any power or authority that possessing a pair of gonads would also give to them.
Sure.
If like the thing that I find remarkable about Trudeau, and I feel like this is our third Christmas party reference already. Very, very smart liberals I know, and I'll include you in this. I think they had a pretty good idea that Trudeau was finished
Yep.
a year and a half before Trudeau knew that he was finished.
Yep.
And one of the interesting features or bugs of the Trudeau era Liberal Party seemed to be, and you would have a better sense of this than I would, but I talk to people and I have eyes. There didn't seem to be, I guess, what we'll call the old boys network anymore that could go tap him on the shoulder and go, man, you've had a great run and
Yeah.
it's time to
So,
go.
I mean, my observation on a couple parts of that. I think, first of all, his inner circle was always very small, but it got exponentially smaller as time went on, right? Like by the end, it was basically two people. And that's not good for anybody. I don't care if you're running a company or a regiment or the country. That's not enough people. Um, the other thing I would say, as a bit of a criticism of the Liberal caucus, is to your point and Selly's, there was nothing that prevented them from getting more loud and forceful, right? It didn't, I've heard a lot of staffers and lobbyists and, strategists around town saying, man, we all owe Chrystia Freeland a big thank you. I'm like, yeah, kinda, except there were 100 and however many of them there were before the election who all could have done the same thing. So I went to caucus last September in Nanaimo, and not very many folks from Ottawa were there in terms of outside caucus and staff. And so I had a lot of chats with caucus members, and I sort of kept saying, like, isn't there, is there some discussion? Is he offering a plan? Is anybody trying to force him? And the universal view was, man, we tried that last year. He's clearly not going anywhere. We're just gonna wait and see what happens. And that was a really weird sentiment then, and it became completely untenable by, again, the Christmas party. And then, the my biggest complaint about his exit process is how drawn out it was and how it pushed his eventual successor, now Carney, into a series of corners around things like trade and Trump, around estimates, around a budget, around, Parliament, around like the clock became a huge enemy that left Carney with essentially no choices in terms of when he could do things except what's rolling out right now.
I'm going to make a comment that's going to be probably for some people akin to the Polyev munching the apple moment, because they're either going to completely agree or think I'm being a gigantic asshole. But I have always said that the liberals are the best politicians in this country because they are amorally ruthless when it comes time to purge. And what we've seen in the last 8 weeks has been how effective the Liberal Party of Canada can be at politics.
Right. And so,
And then which just makes it all the weirder to have seen that very same political machine
yeah,
adrift with smoke pouring out of the funnels for a year and a half.
yeah,
And, I think I would articulate it a little differently than you, but I think we're on the same page. Freeland deserves credit for doing the thing that any of them could have done any
yeah.
point in the 12 to 18 months before that.
So there's this, I think I've never seen a clearer example of familiarity breeding contempt than with the Trudeau guys, right? And because Freeland had been their go-to for all sorts of stinky bags of poo, he thought that he could ask her to do anything and she'd just go, okay, boss, and show up. And I don't know that she was that far ahead of a whole bunch of her colleagues in terms of just running out of yeses. But she had been asked so many times, it's not surprising she was the first one to get there. My biggest complaint about, the Trudeau years was that it was all about Trudeau, right? I mean, he came in, we were in third place. It was about him. He was the brand in terms of rebuilding the party, in terms of a chance at government, in terms of the face of the government, all of it, particularly, like you think back to during COVID, during those daily press conferences, like he was the only face of government other than, the chief public health officer. And so, double-edged sword, it worked while it worked, and then it really didn't when it didn't. And what I genuinely hope, to your point, is that the party faithful, which is not to say, the folks who show up and try and take all the credit at the last minute, but the folks who actually go out and just spent 6 weeks pounding in signs in ridings that we're never going to get the deposit back from, let alone win the seat. But they're still there. They're out volunteering. They show up at conventions. They donate, all of that stuff. I hope those folks, first of all, I hope we get to call them members again instead of just supporters or whatever the hell it is now. But I hope they got the message that they have the power through one mechanism or another to determine the fate of the party, and the fate of the party rests on their participation, right? And so Carney inspired a crap ton of people to come back to the Liberal Party, to take out memberships, to donate, to show up, to, like every event, lots of people, old faces, new faces. It's great. But it's not just about showing up because Carney's going to win. It's about doing the work and making sure that the party is in good shape no matter who's in charge. And so I hope that we all sort of, got our lesson and are back to that.
I want to make to you a case, and I'm not looking for you to agree with it or disagree with it. I just want to articulate it. It is my case against Carney. And I wrote this in a column that I published just before the election. And for the record, I got nothing against Carney as a person. He's very competent, seems like a nice guy. And I still cling to just this little residual daub of patriotism where I always wish any prime minister the best because their success is my success.
100%.
But he's a political rookie who has taken over a party that had completely failed in what I consider to be one of the main jobs of a political party, which is to keep the leader in line. Because everything you were saying about Justin Trudeau, I think is largely true. It's not the first time I've seen liberals go all in on a leader. That seems to maybe be something you guys ought to think about, like have a quiet meeting somewhere and just talk it out among friends. But I'm looking at, here's the problem that I have, and this is what I wrote in my column. believing that Carney is enough to fix what went wrong over the last 10 years requires either believing that he is a Superman or that everything that went wrong over the last 10 years was always fixable and they just never quite got around to it. And I don't believe he's a Superman. And I'm not saying this as a criticism of him. He seems like an unusually intelligent, well meaning guy.
Yep.
But I don't hate Justin Trudeau. And like this country got weird on Justin Trudeau, throwing rocks at him, fuck Trudeau flags. I didn't
Yep.
like the guy's policies. I didn't think he was a good prime minister. I never hated him.
Right.
And I'm not buying a version that even some liberals are trying to tell me that the bad man is gone now and it's going to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how do the liberals as a party? I think it was Dominic Lamont just a couple of days ago. I think it was. Don't quote me on that. But somebody had said, "Oh, don't worry. Prime Minister Carney is going to have a very different relationship with the Western provinces."
Yeah.
Oh, like because he said so. And again, the best case scenario from the liberal point of view is that yes, Mark Carney is a Superman because it would have been impossible for any lesser mortal to do what he's doing. First of all, I don't buy Mark Carney as a Superman. Second of all, if he is, you guys might just be stuck with another Trudeau problem in an election or two. What do you do about that?
All right. So starting at the end and working backwards. I would hope that liberals, both in government and out, take a fairly realistic view of the probability of a fifth term. I think making this term last and getting as much done as humanly possible should be a priority. I look at Mark Carney and I don't know how long he's going to want to do this job, right? I mean, he's said very clearly he's here to fix problems of a pretty significant nature, right? Particularly the Trump stuff. Does he want to hang around if suddenly governing gets mundane? I don't know. But I think there are enough big problems to fix that it could keep him entertained for quite a while. On the, it was Dom who said, he's going to take a very different view of Alberta. Um, Events, dear boy, events, right? I think in a world where Trudeau could afford to ignore the West both electorally and in terms of diminishing role of oil and gas and yada, 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 he was quite happy to. And he had a bunch of folks in his cabinet who felt pretty strongly about that. I think that the situation with the US has made even the most reticent provinces, we know who we mean, open to the possibility of new pipelines. I think there are, I think projects like Energy East have never made any sense. I don't know who the buyer is, but I think LNG to Three Oceans makes an awful lot of sense. That's going to be a viable industry for considerably longer than crude oil. I think that coupling that with hydroelectricity going the other way and also north, by the way, we need hydropower in the north. And, you and I are both students of military history. I think when you start talking about corridors running across the country, you're also talking about lines of communication. In the event you had to move men or equipment quickly for whatever reason, right? And so there's a whole bunch of things that have changed in the last, again, 6 months that make the conversation radically different than it was when Trudeau was prime minister. Is it going to be sunshine and roses and smooth sailing? No. Is Danielle Smith's talk about separatism and whether or not she's just acting to help them out or talking about helping them out going to actually help out Alberta? Absolutely not. She's got a willing partner for the first time in Ottawa who has said he wants to be a willing partner. For the love of God, test that theory out before you start blowing up the economy. Just go see what he says. So I think, like I say, there's a lot that we haven't done in the last 20 years that needs to be done. And I never let a good crisis go to waste.
When I think about the job before Carney, it's a big job.
Yep.
You've rattled off some highlights there.
Yeah.
We could add 15 or 20 more.
Easily.
And what I'm wondering about, and just so the listeners know, 100% transparency, Jamie and I are recording this on a Monday afternoon. It's going to be published Tuesday morning. So by the time the listeners hear this, they still won't know who the cabinet is. But by the time the video of this releases, because we do that later in the evening to get those sweet, sweet video algorithms, there will be a cabinet.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, it's just this really weird standoff between Carney on the one hand needing the freedom to do what he needs to do, needing to be held accountable by a party that I think did not effectively hold the last guy accountable. Meanwhile, you've got an opposition party that basically bought in entirely behind the notion of the leader shall deliver us
Mm-hmm.
and didn't, but he
Mm-hmm.
came pretty close.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just trying to figure out what this parliament is going to look like.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm honestly, so one of the arguments, Jamie, you'll remember this before the election was that whichever way it goes, let's hope for a majority because then we'll
Yep.
have 4 years of stability to deal with a rapidly changing world. We
Yep.
didn't get that. They're pretty close. I think I would call this a functional majority. I don't think Prime Minister Carney needs to worry about his next few confidence votes. I think he'll find a way to get through. Um, but I think in terms of our big picture problems, both domestically and abroad, I don't feel like we solved any of them 2 weeks ago.
Were we going to?
I mean, a man can dream.
Sure. Okay. But look, I think elections don't solve problems. Elections set you up for the solutions, right? And so I think I 100% agree this is a functional majority government. I think once you count Elizabeth May and look, I love Greg Fergus, dear friend of mine, but I kind of hope Chris d'Entremont does end up becoming speaker because then you really do have a functional majority in the House, at least for some period of time. I would also accept Louis Plamondon, who's the Dean of the House and has been an MP for 41 years. Great choice for speaker, but I haven't seen his name in any of the articles. So, I think it will end up being a functional majority in one way or another. Um, I also think that, you know, the bloc have said they'll be cooperative. Say that lasts a year or a little bit more. The NDP are, I have no idea what they are, right? They absolutely were the victims of strategic voting. Is that a permanent feature of Canadian politics, the two-party system? I'm not so sure. But certainly until they are goddamn good and sure that they've got a leader and a chance to go out and win an election, I'm pretty sure they're going to be a pretty loyal lapdog.
The only argument I'd make against that, and first of all, the block is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Like to me, we'll talk about this a bit more in a minute. I want to talk to you a little bit more about the Conservatives and the pivot, but let's put a pin in that for now. The bloc, and I think more to the point, Quebec voters are the smartest voters in this country. I think the Quebec voters, sometime between November 6th and January 20th, they drew the necessary conclusions.
Yep.
And I think the bloc might actually have been slower than the average Quebec voter.
Yep.
And I think the Quebec voter, and I remember I made a point of this because I was telling you before the joy of being right versus the humiliation of being wrong. Something I was right about was very shortly after Mr. Trump was reelected in November, I saw a press conference with Premier Legault, and he was speaking about Canada and Canadians and Canadian interests. And I'm like, ooh, okay.
Yep.
He wasn't doing the bullshit we normally hear from Quebec leaders, including very federalist leaders, which everything is, oh, Quebec and Canada and Quebecers and Canadians. Like Francois Legault wrapped himself in the maple leaf to an extent I never thought I would see a Quebec premier do.
No,
And they figured it out.
Yeah, exactly.
The NDP, though, to your point, I don't know. I don't know what to tell them.
No, I mean, look, first of all, Quebec voters have been the most savvy voters in the country for 20 plus years. And that means they're the fastest moving voters, right? And so there's no block of voters in the country, no pun intended, that moves faster than Quebec and that moves more as a group, right? Like it can be, right? And so throughout this campaign, I had been likening the Canadian voting public that seemed to be switching so quickly from 20 points up for the Tories to basically a tie to Quebec, right? That there had been a collective conscious decision on the part of the country that nope, we're going to go in a different direction. Thank you for your time. Leave your CV at the door. Um, I would argue that Blanchet was slower to that, but got there. And it was in his getting there, particularly at the debates and elsewhere, where he kept talking about, as long as you respect Quebec, I'm happy to be a good partner, Canada. That I think a bunch of those marginal seats, and we're seeing seats in Quebec that are won by one vote, um, became viable for him, right? Like I would say a week before the debate, the Bloc were looking at 12 to 15 seats. And so for them to end up with what are 20, 22 seats, that showed a pivot on their part. The NDP, there are two wings to the NDP, at least. And I mean, well, you can dice it in a bunch of ways, but the one that matters, I would argue, is there are New Democrats, particularly in Western Canada, who believe that they are an actual political party and that they should be fighting to govern the country, right? This is the David Eby, John Horgan, Roy Romano, Gary Dewar, Wab Kinew NDP in Western Canada that is a real political party. They exist to win elections. Then there's the Champagne Socialists in Eastern Canada who seem to only be content to be the party of conscience. You know where you get to have a conscience? In government. Don't have to, but you get the chance to. So this notion that there's this huge component of the NDP that exists in some ephemeral universe where all they ever want to do is bitch and complain and maybe get an amendment passed that they think improves some government's legislation is crazy to me. And so, as a liberal, we exist to win elections. That like the Liberal Party is not a debating society. It exists to win elections. So there's nothing that confuses liberals more than that element of the NDP that just wants to sit around and talk about shit. Like we just cannot get our heads around that. You'll always see liberal premiers very comfortable with Rachel Notley and Wab Kinew and David Eby, because those are New Democrats who want to win. They want to govern. They want to make things happen. We understand that. Don't understand the other folks. And so fundamentally, Jagmeet was possibly the most representative human they could imagine for the sit around and talk about shit group of New Democrats. And he had to go. He should have gone ages ago, right? Like Ottawa's about power. And Jagmeet was sitting here holding Trudeau's you-know-whats for 4 years. Could have asked for anything, could have asked the Prime Minister to fillet him on the lawn of Center Block once a week and probably would have gotten a yes and got nothing, right? And so there's nothing this town disrespects more than someone who has power and doesn't understand how to use it. And that was Jagmeet.
You see, that image is going to be stuck in my head for a while. So on behalf of the viewers and listeners, thanks for that. I don't disagree with the analysis. I'm just now stuck living with it.
It's been in my head for a while.
So I think the divide in the NDP that you're talking about, I think, is true of NDP partisans, but I think it also was reflected in their voting blocks, right? Where the party essentially was trying to figure out a way to be appealing to blue collar working class voters with real social democratic needs for cost of living, community development, community safety issues. And then there was the very well-heeled, I think you called them champagne socialists or limousine, limousine liberals, et cetera, the white-collar, urban, progressive base. And you and I are not the first people to note this before, so I'm not trying to take any credit for it. But I think what we saw in this election was when the NDP finally reached the end of how long they could be both things at once. And, I'd written columns before where I'd said sooner or later the NDP is going to have to decide which of these parties it's going to be, and they're going to have to try and consolidate around them.
Hmm.
But they didn't, and they
Okay.
got attacked on both fronts, and they lost. And so I don't know if I have much more to say on that front.
So here's all I would add is that the NDP have got more or less obliterated for failing to convert from ideological issues to crime, social welfare, cost of living,
Yep,
blue collar, everyday issues. Liberals aren't far behind them on that, and neither are Democrats in the US,
I
right?
know.
That
Oh, the
neither
Democrats might have arrived there last November.
right, so that
Yeah.
neither left of center mainstream party in Canada or the US seems to have much ability left to talk to working class people about making their lives better, despite having spent a decade talking about the working class or the middle class and those who hope to join it or whatever it was. Um, there was a minister for the middle class at one point, as you may recall.
Vaguely.
Yeah. Um, but there's the lack of ability to speak to that, and the fact that the people who represent the most wanton interests of Bay Street and the oil sector, and like that, those folks now suddenly speak to the blue collar working class folks in the industrial belt in this country should tell us there's something wrong on our side of the ledger, right? Like we should be looking at that. We lost, the Liberal Party lost Brampton, most like big chunks of 905, Richmond Hill, over cost of living and crime, right? Polyev won on those issues. And I hope to God that the people around Carney have started thinking about how they're going to do better on that next time, like last week, right? Figure that out because that's where the votes are and where we should have been able to get them.
It's funny, your comments there actually, I got two more questions for you, and your comments there bring me to the second to last one. I talked to a conservative friend of mine after the election. I gave him a week. I let him go home, see his wife,
Yeah.
do laundry, sleep.
Yeah.
And then I called him. I'm going, "How you doing? How you feeling?" And he said, "Pretty pissed off."
Yeah.
He said he wasn't feeling good about it, but he did say to me, and this is kind of where your comment was going. He says, "I will say this though, this Carney coalition ain't going to last." He goes, like the group of voters that actually came together last month and elected, as of right now, 170 Liberal MPs was huge. It was really interesting,
Yep.
and it's incoherent. I just don't see how this Carney coalition lasts. So it's a question for you, not a prediction. If you're advising the prime minister right now on a matter of not policy, but politics,
Yep.
what do you think the next winning Liberal coalition looks like here? Like, where is the Liberal Party going to win future elections? It probably can't count on that happening again.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the party going to go?
Yeah, so I think there's a bunch of pieces to that answer, and I don't pretend to have all of them mapped out. I think the there has to be a I'm starting to hate this word, but progressive center left party that speaks to blue collar working class Canadians who are fiercely patriotic, who believe in Canada as a concept as much as a country. And, this is where Trudeau took a lot of grief, but I understand what he was saying. Canada is a somewhat unique country in that we are proudly multicultural. We don't pretend to be a melting pot. We bring in people from all over the world and want the best from everyone that comes here. We have become a little complacent when it comes to getting rid of the worst that comes with people when they necessarily bring their. I mean, I remember as a kid, people coming around collecting for the boys in Irish neighborhoods in rural Nova Scotia. Like this is not a new thing, right? Like we bring our shit with us, but there needs to be an appeal from a Liberal Party that is attractive to Canadians who work with their hands, to Canadians who own small, medium-sized businesses, to Canadians who are really more focused on getting them and their families ahead in life than they are pronoun wars and all of that other culture, social conservatism stuff that seemed to dominate a lot of Liberal Party dialogue over the last at least 5 years.
I wrote years ago, and a very mean-spirited editor cut it out because they said it was needlessly confrontational and provocative.
I hate it when they do that.
Uh, Look, I get it. It's the job sometimes, but if they'd left it in, I would have looked like a genius. I wrote the problem that Trudeau is going to run into eventually is that microaggressions will stop mattering when the macroaggressions come back.
Spot on.
And they did.
Right.
We had a plague that killed 50,000 of us. We've had wars roiling the world. We have actual fundamental threats to our national security and our sovereignty.
Yep.
You've both mentioned this without kind of fully addressing it. I have never known Canadians to be as alarmed by actual basic public safety and law and order issues as they were before the election and remain.
Yep.
I haven't seen anyone telling me, well, Mark Carney is going to clean up the streets. He got elected for other reasons, but we're still left with disorder in some of our streets and serious crime issues. That's one of the reasons I don't think this Carney coalition is going to be sustainable. He was elected in a very specific context for a very specific reason.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, I don't know. Maybe it's my privilege showing, but I don't see crime and law and order issues as being the do all end all that a whole lot of people seem to legitimately believe they are. Having said that, I do think, like, we haven't even talked about other catastrophes in the world besides Trump, right? I mean, there is a full-on war in Europe happening that is looking a lot more European this week than it was even last week. There is two nuclear-armed neighbors are having a nice little spat with each other in between India and Pakistan.
Yeah.
The global implications of Trump's trade war with China, whether he actually has a deal or doesn't, or the deal lasts or whatever, are massive, right? And so getting Canadians to understand, like I do believe we are inherently better than our American friends at seeing a world beyond our borders and understanding that we are part of something bigger and, to our advantage. I tend to agree with Carney's belief that we are the most European, non-European country in the world. I know there are an awful lot of folks, particularly in the western half of the country, who find that both appalling and fighting words. But there has to be serious effort on realigning our trade, defense, security alliances in a meaningful,
that
lasting
way, based on where I'm sitting. Yeah.
Exactly, that way. And so I hope that with sufficient effort on those fronts and sufficient successes, Canadians can get a bit better perspective on, how bad are things here really? I mean, I'm not suggesting that people aren't struggling and aren't having problems, but it becomes really easy when all you consume is, self-supporting sort of echo chamber social media content about how everything is broken, that you lose perspective on where we are relative to everybody else in the world, right? And so I hope some of that happens and that it helps people sort of look around and, okay, well, that's a real problem. That is shit somebody made up on Facebook.
You're probably not wrong from a strategic level, but I will tell you this. When I found out recently that my neighbor's car had been stolen after the door was kicked down so the keys could be taken, I didn't care that much about artillery fire along the line of control in Kashmir.
Yeah.
That I probably should.
Yeah.
But I do think eventually the Liberals are going to have some problems just figuring out where their next coalition, I don't mean parliamentary, I mean like voter coalition will be. The last question I had for you, go ahead, jump in. I'll get you my last question.
I think One of the things I'd really like to see Carney do is push back on premiers the way he's pushed back on media in some of these interviews. There is an awful lot of the law and order crime stuff that is not a federal issue. Yes,
Yeah.
there's an issue with bail, but the actual policing, the actual enforcement, the actual prisons, jail more than prisons, are actually provincial responsibility
Yep.
and they're being neglected. The same as healthcare, right? This is a fundamentally provincial responsibility where the federal government has a role, but rather than, being quite so deferential every time you're talking about it, I kind of hope Carney stands up and goes, yeah, but, and then provides some facts about who's really got to pull their weight. Anyway, we'll
I
see.
think he can do that if he also fixes the stuff that is at the federal level.
Correct.
Like, I
Exactly.
think if he goes, I don't know why my predecessor allowed there to be dozens of judicial vacancies, but that's fixed. We're fixing the bail law. Be still my beating heart, but maybe drop some of the gun control bullshit. And then you go at the premiers and you
Exactly.
go, we've done our part.
Yep.
You guys have to properly fund your services. You guys have to get your provincial courts figured out. You guys have got to get the mental health element figured out.
Huge.
I think you can do that if you do your part, or I think
100%.
Mr. Carney's predecessor would have done neither of those things. Like, so, all right, last question for you on this one. We've talked a little bit in the last couple of minutes about the Carney coalition. The question I have, you know, I've been asked this a couple of times in recent days by liberal friends of mine who've seen some of my columns or podcasts or public comments, and they've said to me, why do you assume the conservatives are going to stay at 41.5%? And I don't.
Yeah.
I don't assume that. It's very possible that Pierre Poilievre is artificially high right now, too.
Yep.
But it seems to me that the conservative coalition to me seems more coherent right now than the liberal one. Now, I think there might have been some things animating it, particularly around the Trudeau front,
Hmm.
but I can see the conservatives holding on in the 905 easier than I can see the NDP staying obsolete forever and Quebec deciding actually they love Canada.
Well,
Like that, and it wouldn't like a couple of points rebound for the NDP, a couple of points
mhm.
rebound for the Bloc. 2 years from now, that might be all that's needed to get us Prime Minister Poilievre.
Yep.
What do the Conservatives do now?
Yeah. So look, I think that the conservatives are being smart by keeping Polyev. I think as much as I dislike him, I think he is the best option that they've got. And I think that this pattern we got into on both sides of one and done with leaders is just stupid. Like nobody is good their first time out, right? Like you need to let these guys, let these people have some practice, do it a couple times, figure out what works and what doesn't. I think the pressure on Polyev to make some staffing changes, and I think we all know what that means, are going to be enormous once the House is sitting and particularly when he's back in it. I think one of the things that a lot of the seat modelers didn't get right was the assumption that when NDP numbers collapsed, those were progressive left of center voters that would go to liberals. No, turns out some of them just hate liberals and will vote for anybody other than a liberal.
Mhm.
There were more of those in the 905 than I think a lot of us expected. And so the question becomes, this is where I get a little fuzzy about how stable that part of the conservative coalition is can they retain those folks, or was that a Trudeau betrayed us, Trudeau this, Trudeau that anti-vote that went to the conservatives? Don't know. There'll have to be a bunch of analysis on that. I think that the biggest thing the conservatives need to do is understand they got 12 seats in Quebec. I think
Mhm.
that's a good showing. There's room to grow there. The 905. Atlantic Canada was a little, there's certainly a handful of seats there that I thought they would win that they really didn't, and like by quite a bit. I think my biggest concern about Polyev going to Crowfoot, literally the safest conservative riding in the country, is sort of twofold. One, he's not going to learn shit by going to Alberta and taking the easiest path possible, A. But B, there's a non-zero chance of another internecine war breaking out in the Conservative Party between Western social conservatives and Eastern
Uh-huh.
conservatives. And if the leader is purposely saying, well, screw you, you didn't vote for me, Ontario, so I'm going to the home of Western separatism
Hmm.
to be the MP, that's not great for the future of the party, right? That's him picking sides in my mind. And so I don't know. I think if they can hold it together and they can convince those 905 Southern Ontario voters they're not that scary, get back a bit in Atlantic Canada, and it winning Crowfoot by 80% does absolutely nothing for you, right? And so this is where there were several polls during the campaign where it showed the Conservatives up by a couple of points, but the seat modeling still very strong Liberal minority, right? And it's that voter inefficiency. And so, there was neither vote was super efficient in Ontario this time, which is very confusing given the low NDP numbers. We really needed both sides get in and understand what happened there. But it's got to be about expanding the base. And so if all he's going to do is go to Crowfoot and preach the same shit to the same people over and over again, that doesn't grow the base, and we're going to be able to pick off pieces.
First of all, I agree with you entirely on what you just said about Polyev going west. I think it's a mistake. I also think that I said this in our last The Line podcast on Friday. It's just loser energy.
Yeah.
It's taking my ball and going home.
Listen,
And I don't.
Cheryl Gallant, Renfrew Nipissing, Pembroke, Scott Reed, same neck of the woods. Like those are 100% safe Conservative seats that he could have run in and still
Uh-huh.
spitting distance from Ottawa.
I could not agree with you more.
Yeah.
I would add to that I'm trying to say this in the least dickish way possible. If you're going to actually make that kind of a move, one of the problems this conservative campaign already had, I think, was almost that they had replicated some of the failures of the Trudeau government. And that makes sense, right? Because politicians evolve to defeat the guy that they're targeting. And one of the failures of Justin Trudeau, and I've written this many times, and you've touched on it. I don't think I'm saying anything shocking here. The circle of trust was too small. The
100%.
feedback channels were too narrow.
100%.
If Polyev is in Ontario, he's forced to get some feedback.
Yep.
If he retreats to rural Alberta,
listen,
it might not end up mattering.
Well, but I come back to Wells' fourth rule of politics. The guy who runs to be leader of the opposition will always get the job. And if Pierre's running back to Alberta in order to save his ass, there's a real good chance he's running to be leader of the opposition.
Yeah, I think that's accurate because to your point, there are undoubtedly safe seats in Ontario within within a drive of the capital that he could have parachuted into. But no, having lost Carleton, he's running to the safest seat. Now, I'm given to understand through back channels that there was a particular need for that seat to become available. I think there was some personal context there, which I'll tell you once we're no longer recording.
Okay.
So I think there might be some background info there. But yeah, look, I mean, to your point about where those NDP voters go, we're recording this on a Monday, exactly 2 weeks after Election Day.
Yep.
I've been asking my nerds to explain this election to me. They can't yet.
Nope.
It's a weird election.
Yep.
All right. I will let you go on that. Jamie Carroll, always a pleasure. We'll talk again soon. But in the meantime, really appreciate you coming on today. Thanks for this.
Anytime, man. Thanks.
Well, thanks for listening, folks. Great to have you here for another episode of On the Line. We'll be back with you on Friday with another episode of the Line podcast. That was my episode, though, with Ian Lee from the Sprott Business School at Carleton University. Many thanks to him for being here. And Jamie Carroll, liberal pundit and member of our anti-panel of Carroll & Co. Consulting. Great to have him here as well. Check us out at our main page, readtheline.ca. Sign up there if you like us. We hope you do. We'll talk with you soon. Like and subscribe and all that jazz. Have a great one.